The night Margaret Whitmore decided to trust her family again was the same night she almost signed away the only thing her late husband had ever asked her to protect. Margaret Whitmore was 68 years old, and the house she lived in had stood quietly on Maple Ridge Drive for almost 30 years. It was a modest two-story home with white siding, a deep front porch, and a maple tree that had grown tall enough to shade half the yard in the summer. Her husband, Charles, had planted that tree the year their son Daniel turned 10. Margaret still remembered the afternoon clearly. Charles had been kneeling in the dirt with a shovel while Daniel complained about the heat and asked when they could go get ice cream. That was the kind of memory that lived in the walls of the house, the kind that made it impossible to imagine leaving. For the past 5 years, Margaret had lived there alone. Charles had passed away quietly after a long illness, and Daniel had moved across town with his wife, Lauren. At first, Margaret believed the distance was normal. Families grew up. People got busy. But slowly, the visits became shorter, then less frequent. Eventually, the invitations stopped altogether. Margaret never said anything about it. She told herself that young couples had their own lives to build. She told herself not to be the kind of mother who clung too tightly. Still, there were evenings when the silence inside the house felt heavier than it should have. She would cook dinner out of habit, set 2 plates on the table, and then quietly put one back in the cabinet. Months passed that way. Then one afternoon in early spring, something unexpected happened. Daniel called. Not a quick 2-minute conversation, not a rushed holiday greeting. A real phone call. His voice sounded different, softer than usual. He asked how she was doing. He asked if she had been getting out of the house enough. Margaret sat in her kitchen chair, holding the phone with both hands like it might disappear if she moved too quickly. Then Daniel said something that made her pause. Lauren wanted to come by and talk. Margaret didn't answer right away. For years, Lauren had been polite but distant, always smiling in a way that never quite reached her eyes. She had a habit of speaking to Margaret, as if she were managing a difficult customer rather than talking to family. There had never been a clear argument. No shouting, no dramatic scenes, just small moments that slowly pushed Margaret further to the edge of the room. But Daniel sounded hopeful. He said Lauren felt bad about how things had been. He said they wanted to start fresh. Margaret looked around her quiet kitchen while he spoke. The afternoon sunlight was coming through the window above the sink, lighting up the dust floating slowly through the air. For the first time in a long while, something inside her felt lighter. Maybe people really could change. Maybe the distance of the past few years had simply been misunderstandings that no one had known how to fix. So Margaret agreed to the visit. She even baked a pie the next morning, the same apple recipe Daniel had loved since he was a boy. She cleaned the house more carefully than usual, wiping down the dining table, straightening the picture frames, making sure the porch light worked in case they stayed past sunset. By the time Daniel and Lauren pulled into the driveway that evening, Margaret had convinced herself that this visit meant something good. She didn't know yet that Lauren had spent the entire drive over rehearsing a plan that had nothing to do with family, forgiveness, or second chances. Margaret opened the front door before Daniel even reached the top step of the porch. For a moment, she saw the same boy who used to run across the yard after school, his backpack half open and his shoelaces untied. Daniel smiled and leaned forward to hug her, the way he always had, careful and a little rushed, as if he never quite knew how long to hold on. Lauren followed a step behind him, carrying a small white box tied with a thin ribbon. She offered Margaret a polite smile that seemed warm at first glance, but faded quickly when Margaret looked closer. The evening air was cool for early spring, and the porch light cast a soft circle across the wooden boards beneath their feet. Margaret stepped aside and invited them in, the familiar scent of apple pie drifting out from the kitchen. Daniel immediately noticed it and laughed quietly. He said it smelled exactly like the pie she used to bake every Sunday afternoon when he was growing up. Margaret felt something gentle move through her chest when he said that. Small memories had a way of opening doors that had been closed for a long time. Lauren placed the white box carefully on the dining table and said she had brought a lemon cake from a bakery downtown. She spoke in a calm voice, measured and smooth, as if every word had been chosen in advance. Margaret thanked her and said it looked beautiful. For a few minutes the evening felt almost normal. They sat around the dining table while Margaret poured coffee into 3 cups and Daniel talked about his job at the insurance office. He described new clients, longer hours, and the constant pressure of deadlines. Margaret listened quietly, nodding in the right places, enjoying the simple rhythm of conversation that had been missing from her house for so long. Lauren watched most of the time rather than speaking. When she did join the conversation, her tone was gentle, thoughtful, almost unusually attentive. She asked Margaret how the house had been holding up during the winter storms. She asked whether the furnace had needed repairs and whether the roof still leaked near the back hallway after heavy rain. The questions seemed caring at first, the kind of things a daughter-in-law might ask if she truly wanted to help. Margaret answered honestly. She explained that the furnace was still working, but it was old, and that the roof had needed patching the previous fall. Lauren listened carefully, her fingers resting lightly around her coffee mug while she nodded. Daniel eventually leaned back in his chair and said that was actually the reason they wanted to visit. He explained that he and Lauren had been talking about the future and how families sometimes needed to plan ahead. His voice carried the same careful tone Margaret had noticed during the phone call earlier that week. Lauren looked at him briefly and then back at Margaret with a reassuring smile. She said no one wanted Margaret to worry about anything as she got older. She said families were supposed to support one another, especially when it came to important things like finances and property. Margaret did not immediately understand what she meant, but she noticed that Lauren reached down beside her chair and lifted a thin leather folder onto the table. The folder was dark brown and neatly organized, the edges perfectly straight as if it had never been opened before that evening. Lauren placed it between them with quiet confidence, smoothing the cover with one hand while the other hand gently slid it closer to Margaret across the polished wood surface of the table. Margaret looked at the leather folder without touching it at first. The room had grown unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that makes small sounds seem louder than they really are. The ticking clock on the kitchen wall suddenly felt noticeable. The soft hum of the refrigerator filled the silence between them. Daniel cleared his throat and leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the edge of the table. He spoke gently, explaining that he and Lauren had recently been thinking about long-term planning. He said that as families grew older, responsible people tried to organize things before problems appeared. Margaret nodded slowly, still looking at the folder as if it were something fragile. Lauren finally opened it with a careful movement. Inside were several neatly printed pages clipped together in the corner. The paper looked official, the kind used in offices and legal buildings downtown. Lauren turned the first page toward Margaret and explained that the documents were simply a way to make life easier for everyone. She said the idea had come up during a conversation with a financial advisor a few weeks earlier. According to Lauren, the advisor had suggested that families sometimes arrange shared property management so that adult children could help maintain homes and cover expenses when their parents became older. Margaret listened without interrupting. Her hands rested quietly on the table, folded one over the other. She noticed that Lauren spoke with calm confidence, pausing at the right moments as if she had practiced the explanation before arriving that evening. Daniel added that nothing needed to change right away. He emphasized that this was only about protecting the house in the future. If something unexpected ever happened, he explained, it would be easier if the paperwork was already organized. Margaret finally reached forward and touched the top page. The paper felt smooth beneath her fingertips. She read the first few lines slowly. The language was formal and filled with words that belonged in offices rather than kitchens. Terms about ownership structure, shared responsibility, and financial oversight appeared again and again across the page. Lauren leaned slightly closer and pointed to a section near the middle. She said that if Margaret signed the document, Daniel would be listed as a co-manager of the property. According to Lauren, this would allow him to help handle taxes, repairs, and insurance matters without Margaret needing to worry about complicated paperwork. Margaret glanced at Daniel while Lauren spoke. He gave her a reassuring smile, the same quiet smile he had used when he was a child, trying to convince her that everything would be fine. The explanation sounded reasonable on the surface. Houses required maintenance. Roofs needed replacing. Heating systems eventually stopped working. Margaret had already spent several $1,000s fixing small issues around the property during the past 2 years. It was not impossible to imagine needing help later. Lauren continued, speaking in a steady voice. She explained that many families were choosing this arrangement because it made financial planning smoother. She said it protected everyone involved and prevented legal confusion if emergencies ever happened. Margaret listened carefully to every word. Yet something about the moment felt slightly out of place. It was not anything obvious. The tone was polite. The conversation remained calm. But Margaret noticed that Lauren kept her eyes on the documents more than on Margaret herself, as if the pages mattered more than the person sitting across the table. Margaret lifted the top sheet and turned it slowly, scanning the second page with patient attention while the clock on the wall continued to tick quietly above the refrigerator. Margaret read the second page more slowly than the first. The words were polite and carefully arranged, yet the meaning underneath them felt heavier with each line. She had never studied legal language, but she had spent enough years managing a household to recognize when something was more complicated than it first appeared. Terms about shared authority appeared again near the middle of the page. There were sentences describing how property decisions could be handled if multiple names were connected to the same home. Margaret did not react right away. Instead, she lowered the paper slightly and looked across the table at Daniel and Lauren. Daniel kept the same reassuring expression, his hands folded loosely around his coffee mug. Lauren remained composed, her posture straight, her fingers resting lightly beside the folder as if she were waiting for the right moment to speak again. Margaret asked a simple question. She asked why the document needed to be signed now. Lauren answered immediately. She said it was only practical planning. According to her explanation, many families organized paperwork long before it became necessary. She mentioned taxes again. She mentioned insurance responsibilities and future repairs. Her tone stayed calm and patient, as if she were guiding Margaret through something very reasonable. Daniel nodded along while she spoke, occasionally adding small comments about how unpredictable life could be. Margaret listened without interrupting. The kitchen clock continued to tick steadily above the refrigerator. Outside the window, the evening light had begun to fade, leaving a soft blue shadow across the maple tree in the front yard. Margaret thought about the years she had spent inside this house. She remembered repainting the hallway with Charles one summer while Daniel was away at a school camp. She remembered the day they installed the wooden shelves in the living room for family photographs. The house was not simply a building. It held the quiet history of a family that had once felt simple and certain. Lauren gently slid a pen across the table toward Margaret. The movement was smooth and almost casual, but it carried a quiet sense of expectation. She explained that signing the document did not mean Margaret would lose control of anything. It only meant Daniel could help if problems ever appeared. Margaret picked up the pen but did not place it on the paper. Instead, she turned another page in the folder and read a longer paragraph near the bottom. This time she noticed something different. The wording described what would happen if ownership responsibilities changed in the future. It mentioned legal authority that could shift depending on certain circumstances. The explanation was buried inside several sentences that seemed harmless on the surface. Margaret set the pen down again. She looked at Daniel once more, studying his face with quiet attention. Daniel still looked relaxed, but there was a small tension in his shoulders that had not been there earlier in the evening. Lauren leaned forward slightly and asked if everything looked clear. Her voice remained gentle, but Margaret noticed that Lauren watched her hands more than her expression. Margaret closed the folder slowly and rested both palms on top of it. For a few seconds no one spoke. The room felt still except for the ticking clock, and the faint sound of wind moving through the branches of the maple tree outside. Margaret finally smiled politely and said she would prefer to read the documents more carefully before signing anything. Daniel blinked with mild surprise. Lauren paused for a brief moment before her smile returned, though this time it seemed thinner than before. Lauren held her smile for another moment, but it did not reach her eyes this time. She slowly leaned back in her chair and folded her hands together on the table as if she had expected that answer all along. Daniel shifted slightly in his seat and glanced between the two women. For a brief second, he looked uncertain, as though he had hoped the evening would move more smoothly than this. Margaret kept her expression calm. She did not raise her voice, and she did not show irritation. Instead, she opened the folder again and neatly stacked the papers together, aligning the edges with quiet precision before closing it once more. The gesture was small but deliberate, the kind of motion that signaled the conversation had reached a pause rather than a conclusion. Lauren spoke again after a few seconds. Her tone remained pleasant, but Margaret noticed a faint sharpness beneath the surface that had not been there earlier. Lauren said there was no rush, of course, but it would really help Daniel if everything could be settled soon. She explained that property matters often became complicated if documents were left unfinished. Daniel nodded quickly and added that it would simply make things easier for everyone later. Margaret listened to both of them without interrupting. She had spent many years raising a child and managing a home, and she understood the difference between genuine concern and quiet pressure. The two things could sound very similar when spoken with careful voices. She lifted the folder and placed it beside her plate, instead of pushing it back across the table. That small decision seemed to change the atmosphere in the room. Lauren noticed it immediately. Her eyes followed the movement of the folder as if it were a piece of glass that might slip away. Margaret smiled gently and said she appreciated the effort they had made to think about the future. She said it meant a lot that Daniel wanted to help with responsibilities that might become difficult someday. Daniel looked relieved to hear those words. Lauren gave another polite nod, though her gaze remained fixed on the folder resting beside Margaret's hand. Margaret then explained that Charles had always been careful about paperwork. He used to say that important documents deserved careful reading and sometimes a second opinion. She said she intended to follow the same habit before signing anything connected to the house. The mention of Charles seemed to shift something in Daniel's expression. He lowered his eyes for a moment. Remembering his father in the quiet way people remember someone who once filled a room with steady presence. Lauren remained composed, but her fingers tapped once against the edge of the table before becoming still again. Margaret stood up slowly and carried the coffee pot back to the kitchen counter. The warm light above the sink illuminated the small lines on her hands as she refilled the cups. She moved at an unhurried pace, as if the evening were completely ordinary. Yet behind her calm routine, a new thought had begun forming with quiet clarity. For years she had believed distance in the family was simply the result of misunderstandings. Tonight, for the first time, she wondered whether the distance had always been part of a plan she had not noticed before. Margaret returned to the table carrying the coffee pot and refilled the cups with steady hands. The warm smell of fresh coffee filled the kitchen again, softening the tension that had begun to settle over the room. Daniel thanked her quietly and wrapped both hands around his mug as if the warmth might help him relax. Lauren offered a polite smile, but said she did not need more. Her eyes remained on the folder resting beside Margaret's plate. Margaret sat down again and took a slow sip from her own cup. She allowed a few quiet moments to pass before speaking. The silence was not uncomfortable for her. After years of living alone, she had grown used to letting thoughts settle before responding. Daniel finally broke the quiet by asking if she would like him to explain any part of the document more clearly. His voice carried a careful optimism, the kind people use when they are hoping a small hesitation will disappear if the conversation continues gently enough. Margaret shook her head slightly and said she understood the general idea. She explained that the paperwork was about sharing authority over the house so Daniel could manage things more easily in the future. Daniel nodded again, relieved that she seemed to understand. Lauren leaned forward a little in her chair and added that it was a very common arrangement. She said many families did this to avoid complicated legal situations later in life. Margaret listened while she spoke, but she noticed something else at the same time. Lauren's explanations always returned to the same point. Efficiency, simplicity, future control of the property. The pattern was subtle but consistent. Margaret placed her coffee cup down and rested her hands together on the table. She spoke calmly, thanking both of them for thinking about her future. She said she appreciated their concern. Then she added that she planned to show the documents to someone before making any decisions. Daniel blinked once in surprise. Lauren's expression remained composed, but a slight pause appeared before she asked who Margaret had in mind. Margaret answered without hesitation. She mentioned Robert Keller, the attorney who had handled several matters for Charles many years earlier. Robert still lived in town and occasionally sent Margaret holiday cards. The name seemed to land in the room with unexpected weight. Daniel shifted in his seat again, his shoulders tightening slightly. Lauren's polite smile returned, but this time it carried a faint stiffness. She said that was certainly an option, although she assured Margaret the documents had already been reviewed by professionals. Margaret nodded gently and said she believed that. Still, she explained that Charles had always trusted Robert's judgment, and she preferred to follow the same habit. For a moment no one spoke. Outside, the last of the evening light disappeared behind the maple tree, leaving the kitchen lit only by the warm overhead lamp. Daniel finally said that made sense. His voice sounded careful, almost neutral. Lauren agreed a moment later, though the enthusiasm in her tone had softened. Margaret noticed the change immediately. The evening had begun with confident explanations and smooth reassurances. Now the confidence had faded slightly, replaced by something quieter and less certain. Margaret did not comment on the shift. She simply reached for the folder again and placed it beside her chair, as if the decision to wait had already been settled. Inside her mind, however, the calm surface of the evening had begun to reveal something deeper. For the first time since Daniel and Lauren arrived, Margaret felt the quiet certainty that the next few days would show her far more about their intentions than anything they had said across the table tonight. Daniel and Lauren left the house about 20 minutes later. Margaret walked them to the front door the same way she always had, standing beneath the porch light while Daniel thanked her again for dinner. The night air had grown cooler, carrying the faint scent of damp grass from the yard. Daniel hugged her once more before stepping down the wooden porch steps. Lauren gave a polite wave as they walked toward their car parked along the curb. The engine started, headlights swept across the quiet street, and within a few seconds the car disappeared around the corner. Margaret remained standing on the porch for a moment after they left. The neighborhood was peaceful. A single street lamp glowed near the end of the block, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked once before the sound faded into the night. Margaret closed the front door and carried the leather folder back to the dining table. The house felt different now that the conversation was over. Not louder or quieter, just clearer in a way that was difficult to explain. She sat down and opened the folder again, spreading the pages across the table under the warm kitchen light. This time she read every line slowly, the way Charles used to read contracts when he reviewed documents for his construction business years ago. The language repeated the same promises Daniel and Lauren had described. Shared responsibility, future protection, simplified management. Yet buried between those careful phrases were sentences that carried a different meaning. Margaret noticed that several paragraphs described situations in which decision-making authority could gradually shift if the property owner became unable to manage financial matters alone. Another section mentioned conditions under which co-ownership could become permanent. The wording was polite and indirect, but the direction of it felt unmistakable. Margaret leaned back in her chair and folded her hands in her lap. For the first time that evening she allowed herself to consider a thought she had been quietly pushing away. If she had signed the document tonight without reading carefully, Daniel and Lauren might have gained far more influence over the house than they had admitted across the table. Margaret did not feel anger. Instead, she felt something calmer and sharper. Understanding. She gathered the papers neatly and placed them back into the folder. Then she walked into the living room and picked up the small address book she kept in a drawer beside the telephone. Robert Keller's number was still written on the same page it had occupied for years. Margaret looked at the number for a few seconds before dialing. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Robert sounded older than she remembered, but still steady and clear. Margaret greeted him politely and explained that she had received some documents she wanted him to review. Robert listened carefully while she described the situation in simple terms. After a brief pause, he asked if she could bring the papers by his office the next morning. Margaret said that would be perfect. When she hung up the phone, she felt a quiet certainty settle into place. The evening had begun with hope that old distance inside the family might finally disappear. Now a different possibility stood in front of her. Whatever Daniel and Lauren had truly planned would soon become much easier to see in the bright light of someone who understood every word written on those pages. The next morning Margaret woke earlier than usual. Sunlight had only begun to filter through the thin curtains in the kitchen, casting a pale gold glow across the table where the leather folder still rested exactly where she had left it the night before. She made herself a simple breakfast of toast and coffee, moving through the quiet house with slow, deliberate steps. The familiar routine helped clear her thoughts. For years Margaret had believed patience was the best way to handle family tension. She had chosen silence over conflict more times than she could count. But patience did not mean blindness. And this morning she intended to understand exactly what had been placed in front of her. By 9 o'clock she was driving across town toward Robert Keller's office. The building stood on a quiet street near the courthouse, a small brick structure that had been there for decades. Margaret remembered visiting it once with Charles many years earlier when they finalized paperwork for a home renovation loan. Robert opened the office door himself when she arrived. His hair was thinner and fully gray now, but his posture remained upright and attentive. He greeted her warmly and invited her inside. The office smelled faintly of paper and old books. Margaret placed the leather folder on his desk without speaking much at first. Robert adjusted his glasses and began reading the documents one page at a time. The room grew quiet except for the soft rustle of paper turning beneath his hands. Margaret watched his expression carefully while he read. For several minutes, he showed no reaction at all, which somehow made the silence feel heavier. Finally, he placed the final page down and leaned back slightly in his chair. He looked at Margaret with the calm seriousness of someone who had spent many years explaining uncomfortable truths to people who trusted him. Robert spoke slowly, so there would be no misunderstanding. The document, he explained, was not simply about helping manage repairs or taxes. If Margaret had signed it without adjustments, Daniel would have gained legal authority that could eventually shift ownership control of the property. The wording allowed decisions to be made jointly in ways that could gradually remove Margaret's exclusive rights to the house. Robert pointed to several sentences that described these conditions. Margaret listened without interrupting. She had expected something like this after reading the pages herself, but hearing it confirmed by someone who understood every legal detail made the situation clearer than ever. Robert then added something that surprised her even more. He explained that the structure of the agreement suggested careful planning rather than a simple family suggestion. Documents like this were usually prepared with very specific outcomes in mind. Margaret folded her hands quietly in her lap while he spoke. The explanation did not make her angry. Instead, it brought a calm certainty that settled deeply inside her. She thanked Robert for reviewing the papers and asked what he would recommend. Robert gave a small, thoughtful smile and said that if Margaret wished, they could prepare a different document entirely. One that protected her property and clarified exactly who would control the house now and in the future. Margaret looked down at the folder resting on Robert's desk. For the first time since the previous evening, she understood the full shape of what had almost happened. And more importantly, she now understood exactly how she intended to respond. Margaret left Robert Keller's office with the new documents carefully placed inside a plain envelope. The afternoon sun was bright above the courthouse square, and the town looked exactly the same as it had the day before. Cars moved slowly along the street. A few people crossed the sidewalk carrying coffee cups and briefcases. Nothing about the quiet rhythm of the town suggested that anything important had changed. Yet Margaret felt a calm clarity that had not been there 24 hours earlier. She drove home and placed the envelope on the dining table beside the same leather folder Daniel and Lauren had brought the night before. For a moment, she stood there looking at both sets of papers. One represented a future that had nearly been decided without her understanding. The other represented a decision she had made with complete awareness. 2 evenings later, Daniel and Lauren returned to the house. Margaret had invited them for dinner again, explaining over the phone that she had finished reviewing the paperwork. Daniel arrived looking hopeful. Carrying a bottle of wine, he said he had picked up from a local shop. Lauren walked beside him with the same calm smile she had worn during their previous visit. They sat at the dining table once more, the same warm kitchen light shining above them. Margaret served a simple meal and allowed the conversation to move naturally for a while. Daniel talked about work again. Lauren asked polite questions about the house. The rhythm of the evening slowly settled into familiar, quiet patterns. After the plates had been cleared away, Margaret brought the leather folder back to the table. Daniel straightened in his chair slightly, watching her hands with quiet expectation. Lauren remained composed, but Margaret noticed the focus in her eyes return immediately to the documents. Margaret opened the folder and placed the original papers on the table. Then she reached for the plain envelope and set it beside them. She explained in a calm voice that she had taken the time to show the documents to Robert Keller. Daniel nodded slowly. Lauren waited without speaking. Margaret continued explaining that Robert had reviewed every line carefully and helped her understand exactly what the agreement would have done. The room grew very still as she spoke. Margaret then opened the envelope and removed a second set of papers. She placed them gently on the table. These new documents were shorter and simpler. Margaret explained that they established a clear legal trust protecting the house and all property connected to it. The trust ensured that no one could claim ownership or control unless Margaret herself decided otherwise at a later time. Daniel looked down at the new pages in quiet confusion. Lauren's expression remained polite, but the confidence that had filled her voice during the previous dinner had disappeared completely. Margaret folded her hands on the table and spoke with the same calm tone she had used throughout the evening. She said families should always look out for one another, but trust required honesty from every side. She explained that she would continue managing her home exactly the way she and Charles always had. The house would remain hers, protected and independent, for as long as she lived there. No arguments followed. No raised voices filled the room. Only silence settled between them while the kitchen clock continued ticking on the wall. Margaret sat quietly in her chair, knowing that sometimes the strongest answer did not need to sound loud at all.